Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is a video about Victoria 3's Q&A that was hosted in the official Victoria Dev Discord. There was a lot of interesting stuff in there. I already did one video primarily about colonies and warfare. This one will all be about cultures and politics. There were of course a bunch of very interesting mechanics in there. Sometimes I will have a long opinion, sometimes I will barely have an opinion. I just want to bring this to your attention and to have a discussion because I'm a huge fan of those. There was already a lively discussion under the last video, so I hope that this will continue onwards here. Let's start with this question. So we're going to start with cultures first. Can oppressed cultures try and attempt to revolt against their oppressors? The answer is oppressed cultures can seek to revolt and create their own national identity, but they can also seek migration depending on the situation. I really am curious when exactly a culture, or what the RNG, what the percentages are, right, for a culture saying, okay, I want to migrate away, I have an emigration target. We saw that of course in one of the dev diaries as well, and what makes it so that they are willing to rebel. Maybe, and this would be pretty cool, at least in my opinion, if you actually have a revolution, right, a rebellion, and that rebellion fails, maybe that is something that could trigger a proper migration wave, because of course after the opposition is shattered, that is when the opposition says, you know what, let's move out. You can also see this actually in historical examples. I don't know about the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 and 1849, but you can see this in particular. Of course, you had a decent migration from Germany towards America, you know, in the period before 1848 when there already was suppression, but then after 48-49, that is when many people migrated as well and sought refuge in the New World. So that is an interesting mechanic. I would like to see some elaboration from the devs there going forward. Now the next question is, will there be dynamic melting pot cultures? For example, in the teaser we could see an Afro-Caribbean culture and Afro-American culture. Could similar combinations develop for other cultures like Asian-British, Asian-American or Afro-German? The answer is we do not have a dynamic melting pot system in place for cultures. I will tell you outright, as somebody that has followed CK3's Royal Court and the accompanying culture update quite the entire time, right, very, very proactively, I wish it weren't so. Ultimately, of course, I thought about this as well, and there is one big thing that makes me worry whether you can have a dynamic melting pot culture system similar to how CK3 does it, because of course, first and foremost, in CK3, so if you weren't following, they are dissecting culture much more closely than it has ever been done in any Paradox game beforehand, via language, via the actual naming schemes, via the actual, you know, inheritance schemes and such. All of that stuff will be integrated within the new culture model, and you can actually change it as you feel. I will tell you, I do think that categorically migration in CK3 is so much less common than you would ever have it in Victoria 3, that the sheer number of melting pot cultures you would have in Victoria 3 could be incredibly overwhelming and negatively affect how you actually enjoy the game. What do I mean in particular here? When, for example, a culture has a certain obsession, right? We heard about obsessions already. I would like to hear more about that in detail, but where I'm coming from is if it has an obsession, what that means is that you need to treat that culture differently. If there are 1,000 tiny cultures and only one of them has gotten this obsession, you won't actually care about it. What do you care that they are obsessed with opium, right? If it's like 5 people, who cares? The rest is splintered up between German American, French American, etc, etc, etc. So I think there needs to be a different approach compared to CK3, otherwise it quickly could basically become just spam. I thought about the same thing as well for the German culture split. You know, what do you do? Do you do North German, South German? Do you do Bavarian, Württembergian, and so on and so forth? But ultimately, I, as it stands, tend to say I really want something as granular as CK3's methods. However, you really need to account for the fact that Victoria 3 just has much more migration. At the moment, it looks like, for most cultures, if they migrate to you, for example, let's say Bangladeshi pops migrate to America, at some point they will simply, you know, go over into a different pop that is then an American pop. So they will slowly but surely sort of phase into that rather than being Bangladeshi American. Again, it would be very interesting, but there are many, many questions as to why it wouldn't just dilute the actual gameplay enjoyability. So yeah, that's my point of view on the issue. The next question is, will some cultures have areas they specialize in? For example, Nepali could be better soldiers, while Norwegians could be better fishermen. The Nepali thing, I believe, that is about the... Are Nepali troops the Gurkha troops? I'm honestly, I'm not even sure there, but I do know that they have at least a bit of a history and a bit of a legacy when it comes to their prowess in battle. Now, let's read the answer. The main problem I have with that is the unfortunate implications of saying people are just innately better at the thing or another. A Norwegian who moves to central Iowa isn't going to be a terribly good fisherman, and a Nepali who has never experienced war in his or her lifetime isn't going to have much experience at combat. That is definitely one of those things where I completely agree with the dev. I understand, and it has been depicted in the Paradox games in various ways, I understand people saying, hey, it would be easy, would be pretty straightforward to understand if certain cultures would just have benefits because of the way they have been living for certain centuries, decades, maybe even millennia, right? But I will say that I think this can be shoved into other issues. So, for example, if you, and we had this in the tech dev diary just this Thursday, if you go and say, all right, we have this tech, we have specialized in warfare, our civilization, our society is built around warfare, then obviously these pops will be much more focused on that, right? Their professions will be much more focused on that. And if they were to migrate, they would initially have the job qualification, for example, officer or serviceman and whatnot. So they would immediately tend and trend towards this. So I do think you can solve this by not giving it to cultures, but by rather giving it to societies that follow a general culture, right? Like a general idea of existence. So, yeah, basically, I'm very much against cultural bonuses. I think it should be tied to the actual development of that society as you go through the game. Alright, and that was already everything on culture, so let's do politics now. There's a bunch more on politics, I can guarantee you. Let's check this out. Will the Japanese emperor be handled in a special way before the Meiji Restoration? Japan is ruled by the shogun at the start of the game. If you restore the emperor who is restored will be the historical reigning monarch, so that might be Meiji, might be Hirohito. Depends when and if you do the restoration. Before the restoration, the emperor is a powerless figurehead, not represented as a character. There were a number of interesting questions, I think weeks back, maybe months back at this point, that were basically asking, will you keep the historical lineage of a house? So, for example, if I am Germany, I become communist and Wilhelm I has to go, right? Then I become a monarchy again. Does Wilhelm I come back? Is there some sort of family tree that is tracing it? Is there nothing at all? Is it a randomly generated name? The answer is obviously we don't know. But what we do know is that the game, in Japan's case, doesn't actually create characters for the emperors. It basically just says, in this year, this emperor would take power if they were a character. And then if you reform, if you do the Meiji Restoration, you will be seeing that exact emperor. This seems more like a very Japan-unique scripting issue or effort rather than something that actually is how monarchs are remembered. I can imagine either. I can imagine that you basically just have a lineage, much like you would have maybe party names, but I think that isn't actually true. I think that it is somewhat randomly generated, because if you think about it, these monarchs will, I think in all cases, be leading an interest group. And I don't think that they will push out an existing leader of an interest group if they are newly generated. So where I'm coming from is that I think at least to like 1 or 2 or 3 generations down, they will be having some names, some characters that already have certain leanings, right? And they get just employed once they become king. In Japan's special case, again, because the actual ruler isn't the emperor in terms of game mechanics, you're looking at a situation where they aren't even emulated to that degree. But I think that the general monarchy emulation will not just say the historical king is Wilhelm I, so or the historical emperor. So if you are in this time period, you can only have Wilhelm I. I think, of course, that's a bit crazy, but I will tell you, it might be that way, even if I don't want it to be that way, because I don't actually know. I'm just hoping here. That's basically my 2 cents. Alright, can pops start political movements to ban goods like prohibition of alcohol? The political movement system is only used for laws, and the banning of certain goods is not something we model using laws in the game, because you can take that decision to ban, to tariff and whatnot, without having to have any political process behind it. There is surely a political process behind even having tariffs, you know, the base idea of it, but I will say that this is one of those decisions, much like the taxation levels, that you can do in a very, you know, free way in the actual menus without your interest groups being concerned by it as you change it. Having said that, there are certainly events relating to your population's feeling on certain goods, like alcohol and opium. So I think, and we read about this in the tech dev diary as well, I think that alcohol and opium and all that stuff is basically part of the journal system. If you start having an opium problem, if people dislike opium, people will have, there will be a journal situation, whatever that is. Again, we're going to see the details in a couple of weeks, but that is how basically pops tell you we would like this illegal. There is no process, there is no mechanic for us to force you to make it illegal, but if you make it illegal, we will be very thankful. I think that is basically how they're going to be approaching this, but I would like to see it in action. The journal system seems very promising, but I will say that unless they have a direct tool to do it, there's a good chance that the player might just ignore it, and any game mechanic that is completely ignorable is not really a good game mechanic, so very curious in how that works out. Is it possible to exile leaders of an interest group and suffer from the consequences of such an action? I love this question. This is a really good question because the way characters play into this, we know that there are characters that lead interest groups. They bring their own traits in. We know that generals and admirals can become, you know, characters that lead interest groups, and we know that your leader, I believe, can lead an interest group, or at least can be a member there. But can you influence that? Can you do something with them? Let's check it out. Exile is a possible outcome of events, and there are consequences for this. Yes, we don't have mechanics for exiling IG leaders, though, primarily because we think such on-hands character management would make the characters less impactful, and the characters are meant to embody certain patterns of thoughts and not just be troublesome individuals where, if you get rid of them, the ideas go away. This is also a very good point, basically confirming that there will be a mechanism that, yes, leads to exile, but you don't just have a button that says exile this IG leader just because they have a trait that you dislike, because obviously having that trait being a rock in your way that you need to kick away or run against and then fall over, that is the point of them, right? Just discarding them would just be very meaningless. The Victoria way of dealing with difficult leaders is primarily to suppress their interest group and rob their supporting pops of power. That sounds perfect. It is primarily led via the pop gameplay, right? As it should be. How important will religion be in the game? Will there be a religion map mode? Religion primarily influences politics by who is discriminated against and also plays a role in the devout interest group being quite strong, especially in the beginning of the game. As for your second question, yes, we're aiming for both a nationwide and a global religion map mode. Love it. I love it. I'm worried. I think many of us are worried that with the fact that yes, pops can be assigned to certain provinces or to certain tiles if necessary, based on their workplace, right? It might make map modes more difficult. This is great news. Give me a global, give me a religion map mode. Frankly, even if it is on the state level, I don't really care. I just need that stuff though. Like, we need those modes to really get a good overview of where something is, what is going on. And I really enjoy the fact that some cultures, or rather some nations, will have a much more, you know, just involved devout interest group. I can, for example, think of, I mean, I think we already saw that the Church of England is part of the ruling faction in Great Britain, but that surely is a very different influence from, for example, being the Vatican States, right? That is very different. Or being Russia. Russia, of course, taking the Church, the Orthodox Church, also incredibly seriously, and that could guide your policies. I would be very interested in actually seeing how that plays out, but yet again, a question of actually seeing some gameplay. Let's hope that gameplay arrives, you know, like around maybe February, maybe March, something like that. Will there be assassinations in the game that might result in an earlier change of head of state for the country? There had been multiple attempts on both Kaiser Wilhelm and Queen Victoria, on Bismarck as well, for example. We definitely have political assassination events. Let's go. When they say assassination events, there are two routes here. I'm hoping for the second one, but who knows. The first one is that it's basically much like Victoria 1, much like Victoria 2. My god, I played Victoria 1 just recently, and the events of like, your stockpile slightly increased, slightly decreased, slightly increased, very annoying. Victoria 2 not that different, except with the spam for political campaigns, just absolutely atrocious to play that. So they could do that in Victoria 3 as well, where they basically have, oh, here's a random event, and this guy got assassinated. But I'm hoping that this, again, is really intertwined in the journal system, because if true, god, that would be beautiful, having actual storylines in a game about the population that then play out there, right, where you have basically stages, similar to maybe CK3's, for example, CK3's plots, right, where you get certain events that belong to this plot, and you can then make choices of what you want to spend, what you don't want to spend, and then you have a chance of getting X or Y ending. I would really, really enjoy that if they actually focused on that almost exclusively, rather than pushing out, you know, individual events that, oh, it's event number 32 again. Happy. You know, that's exciting. No, let's skip over that. I think we can abandon that. There's no need for many events of that nature anymore. We have seen the ability to play democratic and socialist council republics. Is it also possible to play as a proletarian dictatorship? Absolutely. The council republic law can be combined with most other laws, including everything from autocracy to anarchy. So this is actually like a really... It needs to make click here, basically, because the way we know ideologies from Victoria, from any Victoria game, but also from any other game, be it Hoi 4, whatever. Actually, oh my god, now that I think about it, Hearts of Iron 2, Darkest Hour, I believe Hearts of Iron 3 also did this, where you actually had individual sliders that then in sum would, you know, basically determine what your actual ideology is. But Victoria 2 primarily was, okay, this is the Workers' Party, they're social democratic. That's the way it is. They have some other issues like, are they anti-war, are they pro-military, that sort of stuff, right? But the fundamental idea was, you are this ideology, period. That's the way it is. The way it works in Victoria 3, and the way it seems to be working, is that you aren't a democratic socialist council republic as a law. Like, there is no ideology that is that way. It's rather the consequence of the sum of everything that is going on in the laws of your country. And that is pretty cool, because it means that a proletarian dictatorship very much doesn't need to be the same as the proletarian dictatorship next door, right? There can be significant differences in their laws, in their in what they prefer and what they like. Just the general dictatorship is led, you know, by the proletariat. So don't imagine this as like, okay, can I like have proletarian dictatorship? I click the button and I'm a dictatorship? No, it's more like, at least the way I understand it again, it's more governed by the total of your laws. I really, really love this. I think that is a big step up. That is much more granularity right there. Are we able to change to the other side or switch tags if a civil war breaks out? Yes. Easy answer. Very happy. I love it. Again, we had this topic as well with warfare, right? With the Sepoy Rebellion, where Imperator Rome does a fatal mistake, in my opinion, where if you if you lose against the rebellion, your game is over and you can't play the rebellion. And the rebellion is also, I think, pretty far behind, like in your research progress and happiness and whatnot. That's a big mistake. I think Stellaris doesn't even really have civil wars anymore. Didn't they just like sort of cancel that feature? Like it just doesn't fire anything. Hoi 4, obviously, like in certain circumstances, you totally can take over. Maybe you can take over at every point at this point, you know, like nowadays. But I know that, of course, it focuses on letting you choose when to have and what civil war to have. So, hey, there are some good approaches in Paradox games so far. There are some bad approaches. I think this is the ideal approach. Yep, of course, if there's a rebellion, if there's a civil war, go play them and maybe die or maybe survive and have a different country afterwards. Can we form nations like Scandinavia? Yes, it will be possible both to form larger nations and to release and play as a smaller nation. We'll get into more detail on this in a future dev diary. I want to focus on the larger nation stuff here, because they already confirmed that to rise up in your rank, if you're a kingdom, for example, if you're a kingdom, you get a certain level of prestige. If you're an emperor, you get a higher level of prestige. And there's this really funny example there where Queen Victoria was like, yeah, make me Empress of India so that Germany isn't like the Kaiser, you know, be above me. Are you kidding me? No. We're making Empress of India right here. The political establishment in Great Britain really pushed for that at that point. And that is a precedent right there, but it also means that you need to have plenty of potential examples where you could form an empire, right? It could theoretically, listen, I don't think this is coming, I doubt this, but it could be something like CK's, you know, the Euromap, where it's like duchies, kingdoms, empires, and that's it, right? It could be that. I kind of doubt it though. I would be very surprised. I think it is entirely governed by a tag that is likely tied via their culture, maybe their religion, to a certain rank up title, to forming a larger nation like Scandinavia. I doubt that if I am, for example, Prussia and I don't form Germany, instead I conquer all of Scandinavia, then I can actually form Scandinavia. I assume this is, much like Victoria 2, limited to just actual Scandinavian nations, maybe Estonia as well. But honestly, I wouldn't be against like a bit of a de jure map, because ultimately, I mean, no, it really depends. You can make this very flexible. You know, if France, for example, takes India, they could also, if it says, hey, are you from Europe? Is your capital in Europe? And you hold India, you can become emperor, right? I do think that might be an option. And I wonder how republics do it. I wonder how republics do it. How is France as a republic going to level up? You know, how are they going to become the emperor tier prestige level? Who knows? We may find out later. Oh, and I love this one. Will nations automatically turn socialist or communist once they get a trade union IG into power, like in Victoria 2, where Russia suddenly becomes the Soviet Union, or do the trade unions have to pass specific laws to get there? Trade unions aren't inherently communist, and communism isn't inherent to trade unions. Isn't inherent to trade unions. I don't even think that's a mistake. And it's not just a matter of being in government, you have to actually pass communist laws to be a communist country. Much like what I talked about earlier, right? The way they make this work here, where it is the sum of all laws, and then of course the ideology of your IGs, but the ideology of your IGs mostly is focused on what laws you will be passing. And they talked about trade unions or labor unions not necessarily being communist. That is of course something where I'm very interested in how it actually goes. If you unlock the tech of anarchism or socialism or whatever else there is, somebody else unlocks it and then it comes into your country. Is it basically weighted where, you know, one IG, so in this case the labor unions, say, hey, I'm more likely to become socialist with every of my pops that is a radical, for example, because radical ideas like socialism require radicals, right? This could mean, and that would be something that I'm very excited for, I think I mentioned in the last video as well, that could mean that if I'm Russia and I keep the trade unions very happy, they're in government, they can't complain, they may not even adapt socialism. I would be super happy if this adoption sort of was only focused if they are actually unhappy. But we'll have to see about that as well. But this is a big topic. Keep this in mind, that your ideology appears to not be determined just by, well, the name of your ideology, but rather by the actual laws that have passed. Huge change, big fan. Although events aren't going to be railroaded, will we still see history play out roughly as we would expect, as long as the player doesn't interfere? That is, wink. That depends on your expectations. Wink. We're not taking the approach that there is one platonic way that history played out, and if you don't poke at it, it will repeat itself. Rather, historical progression is the emergent consequence of millions of interacting events based on material conditions. What this means in practice is that while a lot of things will progress roughly as you might expect, countries are more likely to fight over shared homelands, technologically advanced countries are more likely to do well financially, a country with a lot of colonies are likely to dominate the seas, and vice versa. There will also be plenty of butterfly effects, where, for example, a mass migration from China to Argentina will change the power dynamics in South America, which might cause the US to reconsider their interests there, etc. Our aim here is that some events should be recognizable, while the remainder should be justifiable, and as few events as possible should feel inconceivable. I think that, much like Victoria, I mean, in Victoria we have HFM, HPM, and all the other, like, forks and offshoots, don't worry about it, but in CK2, for example, we have HIP, in CK3 we also have the historical, the mods for historicity, right? For every game, basically, for Hoi 4 as well, Black Ice, we have variants that allow you to go through a game that follows the historical guideline. And I think that is very much perfectly fine. I like these mods. I love HRP, for example. But it is also very obvious that what many players come there for, I think, and what the devs have been focusing on for ages now, is basically the possibility of what if. And this is basically what is reflected here. What is happening should be realistic, or it should be emulated in a way that at least feels realistic, even if maybe there's like some, some stuff that doesn't really make sense. But it should also be something that is possible. So, like, they never want to say no, basically. This is improvisation theater, there's the yes principle, you have to say yes and in this case, it's yes, you can do this, and there are these consequences attached. I personally am a big fan. I definitely will be playing the historicity mods as well. I think there's a lot of quality there, but I also think that these emergent systems that they have implemented give you a very different gameplay feeling. The worst fears that I have is that when they say emergent gameplay, there's like a bunch of instances where it really is and really works very, very well, and then there's like an instance where, Africa gets settled by France, but they only like settle in these dotted formations. I mean, this already happens in Victoria 2. Colonization in Africa looks awful in Victoria 2. How that actually plays out, right? How the emergent gameplay actually plays out, who knows? But in reality, of course, it's basically saying we have the historical events that can potentially occur, but then the butterfly effect may ruin this, and instead of Belgium getting the Congo, it could be Sweden. Hey, who knows, right? Will there be reasons to keep the upper class happy on the cost of the lower and middle class, even though the upper class is just a fraction of your nation's population? Absolutely. Firstly, if you are deliberately playing as an autocratic reactionary country, you of course want to favor the old guard power groups. But also remember that wealth and certain laws boost the political power of pops, and if you try to pass laws that favor the poor, the rich will push back. So even if you want to reform out of this, you need to be very careful about what you do, or else you may have a revolution on your hands. And I think, yeah, I mean, if you're disrespected as an interest group, if you see your wealth and your power slip away, you're gonna try your best to stop that from happening. So very reasonable, of course. Can democracies influence what interest groups are in their governments? Yes, as a democracy, you will be able to reform your government by adding and removing parties and interest groups. However, government constellations will vary on how legitimate they are. Right, legitimacy of course plays a big role there. It is very interesting here because parties of course were confirmed. They haven't really gone into the details yet. There's a big implementation. Now that I think about it, Grugy was implementing that and now he's gone from the company. God bless whoever's working on it now. I hope Grugy is having a good time, of course. But fundamentally, what is interesting to me here is that it appears that parties are like a whole deal. If you are an interest group not part of a party, if there are no parties, then you can be sorted in and sorted out as the player sees fit. But if you are in an interest group in a party, then you may have to deselect that entire party, which is exciting, of course. You could also, and I wonder how deep the mechanics go there. If there is a mechanic in which you could try to break up parties, I would be a big fan. Just think about the turmoil, for example, in the SPD, that then ended with the SPD and the USPD, later on the KPD, right? So where we're looking at a situation where basically they split, and that had very different outcomes, basically, where in the end, of course, in 1918, I think it was 1918, right, where Friedrich Ebert was the president of Germany. He was an SPD member, and, with his cooperation, with his work together, the USPD, I think it was still the USPD at the time, right? Members were killed when they started a revolution, the Spartacus Uprising, that's what it's called, right? Almost forgot the name there. And that is such a, like, straight... They basically left each other behind entirely. They went completely different roads there, based in 1914, of course, and then going into the end of World War I and the revolution in Germany, and then their attempted second revolution. This deviation is something that I really want to see. Interest groups that yesterday were friends can tomorrow maybe be enemies if they don't follow the same ideology anymore. Very interesting stuff. I'm really hopeful for that. How does the government form affect how laws pass? Does an absolute monarchy like Prussia have an easier way to pass unpopular laws that, are hated by many interest groups compared to a constitutional monarchy like Great Britain? More authoritarian laws will help you pass laws faster. So an autocratic monarchy that suppresses opposition interest groups can pass laws quickly and with less resistance than a democracy with a strong opposition. Of course, that has its own downsides. I do want to clarify something here, I think, that may be lost in translation if you get it, if you misunderstand this. The way I am reading this means that there is no fundamental difference between any different law passing processes. It's still the, hey, you want to pass a law, and then there's the question of, will it advance? Is there a debate? Will it be stalled? Etc., etc. And I think that it's just easier to basically not be stalled, to basically not have a debate, if you are suppressing the other opposition parties that don't want this law passed, which ultimately means that we're looking at a situation where autocratic, much like the ideology question works, right, with the laws determining it, we're looking at a situation where the autocratic nature of a government is expressed in its laws, which then basically suppresses certain interest groups and then basically leads to the fact that you can pass laws easier. There is no change in the process from how I am reading this. The process itself appears to be staying the same, and I'll be honest with you, completely adequate in the sense that this clearly does exactly what it is supposed to do. If you have autocratic laws, yes, of course, the process is technically still the same, but in reality it isn't, because there doesn't need to be a debate if all of the opposition groups are marginalized, right? That is at least how I'm reading this. Will there be a negative impact for having a large empire? So this question to me sounds much like overextension and whatnot. We know this concept from Stellaris. We know it to a degree from CK3. It plays barely any role. And CK2 was a bigger role, of course. We know it from EU4. And this is basically one of those automatic, yes, this modifier comes in, now you just don't have the administration, that's just the way it is. Although Stellaris follows a bit more the Victoria 3 capacity model for sure. But yeah, that is basically what the question here is. You have to pay for administrating it, not to mention that large empires tend to come with a bunch of minority cultures and religions that have outrageous ideas about self-determination. I love this answer, because what this answer basically states is there is no gameplay or rather arcadey modifier that just says, oh, nope, you're overextended. There you go. You can influence this. You can, have more administration by having more buildings, by having more bureaucrats. You can go and, suppress minorities, basically having these certain laws to do that. These sort of things are, yet again, an emergent system rather than, no, you expanded too fast, so we have a penalty for you here because, much like Imperator Rome still is aggressive expansion, we have a penalty for you here that makes people more unhappy. In reality, of course, that's not what this, how it plays out. In reality, the way it plays out basically is, no, if you're larger, you just have more things to take care of. And that is trouble enough. I like this approach much, much more over the board game style approach that Imperator, of course, also had, but I do want to say that EU4 and Imperator in particular have dedicated fan bases. I mean, Imperator less so, because the Imperator in particular was moving away from the board game approach, of course, but EU4 has very dedicated fans that love this approach, where it's a bit more understandable in a pure numbers way, right? So yeah, that's for them. I very much enjoy this option instead. How big a part will religion play in conflict and government? This connects slightly to the question that we had at the start. Like how the Crimean War started with who protected Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In terms of foreign conflicts, my ambition is that this should depend on AI strategies, which in turn are partially driven by ruler personalities, laws, and governing IGs. Think, for example, about Russia, right? About the Ottoman Empire. Think about Bulgaria, maybe, if they have a strong church as well. Think about Austria-Hungary, should they have a very tight connection to the Pope. And that is very, very cool. In Victoria 2, I mean, religion played basically no role whatsoever. In this one, it should play a role if your society cares about religion. And yes, society cares about religion if your devout interest group is very powerful. That is a very sensible approach. I really, really like this. The AI strategies, and we heard this as well, that you can mod this much more easily. I am very excited to see what is moddable, what can be changed, and what can be fine-tuned. Some AIs should care a great deal about religion when dealing with other countries, and perhaps have an explicit goal to try and free pops of their primary religion. Others should not consider it particularly important. Again, if the Ottomans say, hey, I am the Caliph and I do want to create an actual caliphate rather than just having this as a novelty title, then this should be supported by Victoria too, and it looks like it is. Big fan. Big fan. How many distinct government types or ideologies are in the game so far? This is again confirming what I talked about earlier. A government is made up from the laws of the country, and there's so many potential combinations of laws out there. I'm not actually sure how many distinct sorts of governments are possible at the moment. Right. That's effectively how it is. Right. This is a really, really interesting approach. Very much reminiscent. I mean, Stellaris to a degree does it as well, of course, right? But Stellaris doesn't need approval of anything if you change the law, just sort of happens. You do get modifiers, of course, from your pop groups in Stellaris, but it's much, much different from the IGs here. And it does remind me, it's kind of reminiscent of Darkest Hour of Hearts of Iron 2, you know? I kind of like that stuff a lot, where they had the sliders in Darkest Hour, which now actually becomes laws that you need to pass. I like it. Can interest groups be banned in authoritarian countries? More authoritarian countries have an easier time influencing their IGs to irrelevance. That being said, it's not as simple as, you know, simply banning an IG. If they have the clout, they will attempt to fight back instead of heading off meekly into irrelevance. Sounds good. Sounds very, very good to me. You can, of course, fight against them. You can suppress them in particular. Just think about the laws that Bismarck passed against the Social Democrats in Germany. Didn't work. The SPD spread like wildfire at the time. He even went so far as to pass, you know, this overarching healthcare and pension system and whatnot, the insurance system that Germany still is influenced by today. However, the SPD kept growing. It's just never that easy. It's just not that easy. But you should be able to engage with it, and that is clearly something that you can do here. Can you voluntarily embrace communism or fascism or so on, instead of deliberately losing a rebellion? Absolutely. All laws can be enacted if you can keep supporting IGs in power long enough to pass them. There you go. Makes sense. You need IGs that support it, and if it's the majority that supports it, then you won't have a civil war. You won't have to have a revolution. You can just pass it. Of course, there are historical examples for this as well, very much both in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, and in Italy, when Mussolini and Hitler rose, neither of them had a civil war, neither of them had an actual revolution, even though they may have wanted to depict it this way. No, it was all within the construct of their old state, right? The old state basically handed over power. That is just the way it was, and that is something that can be emulated with this. Big fan. Will it be possible for Austria to unify Germany? Yes, but only if they don't become Austria-Hungary. So this is an interesting one. I really like this, because Austria-Hungary was a consequence of Germany being formed. It was a consequence of turning away from saying we need to have our interests, secured in Germany and whatnot. It was a move to do that. Forming Austria-Hungary, saying we are deliberately creating an empire that is multicultural, multi-ethnically, charged, built up, basically, because, I mean, that's what Austria-Hungary was. It was a ticking time bomb, if you will. If you do that, then you are clearly no longer focusing on Germany. You're clearly no longer focusing on the German Confederation, should it still exist. So yeah, big fan of this, which, by the way, let me bring back my favorite complaint. There appears to be no German Confederation mechanic. Not that Victoria 2 had any meaningful mechanic there, but man, I will miss that. The real and proper German Confederation mechanic, even if you do it in a sense like Stellaris Confederations, even if it's completely useless because it's so, frozen, because neither Austria nor Prussia want to agree with the other side, no matter what it was, I am very sad that we don't actually have a German Confederation mechanic that could, by the way, also be used to actually tackle the revolutions of 1848, 1849, because never forget that those revolutions where they tried to give the crown from the gutter to Prussia, they were not outside of the German Confederation's framework, they were within it. The German Confederation, in the name of the revolutionary parliament in the Paulskirche in Frankfurt, went and beat up the Danes. They didn't do that because the German Confederation still existed while the revolution was going on. It was one element. Bismarck himself sat in the Paulskirche parliament. So yeah, that's a big loss for me. The German Confederation would be awesome. Who knows when and in what form it will come, but it's definitely something that I'm missing. Forming Germany has been mentioned as a diplomatic play. Are there conditions for this play to be started, or could any German state start it on day one, albeit with no guarantee of succeeding? There are conditions. Some nations need a certain tax, such as nationalism. That is very well, I believe this was part of the decision requirement for either the North German Federation or for Germany. I'm actually no longer sure. But I'm pretty sure it was part of the decision requirement. But you need that to form them and to launch a play to form them if one exists. And Germany is one such nation. There you go. I like that there is a soft sort of a prevention thing there. You don't need to get nationalism, but you can surely get it very early. I assume that nationalism is, you know, one of the early texts that we saw. I don't remember, actually, I don't recall seeing it in the dev diary itself or seeing it mentioned there, but I will tell you, perfectly fine. It shouldn't be instantaneous, and this also means that, of course, modders can work with this themselves. Is it possible to have an autocratic monarchy where the monarch is just a figurehead and actual power rests with someone else? It's possible to have an autocratic monarchy where the monarch is part of an IG that is not part of the ruling interest groups. We'll have a challenge in making that government viewed as legitimate amongst the people, but it is not impossible. I guess you could say, and this is outside of the time frame, but this sort of is what happened in the French Revolution, right? That's how I would depict this. You could also say that, I mean, the Paulskirche would also count, but again, we don't have a confederation. But I would say this depicts this because before the revolutionaries cut off the head of the French King Louis XVI, I mean, they effectively were parliament in his name, but he certainly didn't support them, right? So I like that this is possible. I want to see how hard it is. I will definitely, honestly, I'm marking that down. I want to test this. I want to have a government basically formed against the king, against the emperor, without that government necessarily wanting to get rid of the king or the emperor. Will every major political decision require some sort of political approval, or will there be unilateral choices like releasing nations in EU4, EU4, or passing laws in Stellaris? Not everything requires approval and consensus, but that doesn't mean it isn't without consequence. Paul Depré, who, by the way, if you didn't know that, they have a degree in economics, actually. But more importantly, Paul Depré has answered this question, and the way I interpret this is, and the way that they have depicted it so far, is that laws fundamentally will need a consensus. They will need approval. This can be very fast if you're suppressing all of the opposition, right? But it can also be very slow. However, changing a tax rate, changing subsidies and whatnot, will change how pops are situated in their wealth, how they are situated from their point of view, how they enjoy, you know, the benefits of it, whether they don't enjoy it, whether they are losing access to, to education, that's the word. If they are losing access to education and all that stuff, they will be very unhappy with you, of course. So you can change tariffs, you can change subsidies, you can change production methods that then require different people to work there, meaning you're firing people without needing democratic consensus. But those pops will still now have an opinion that is likely negative of you, and others that you just benefited may be positive of you, so there will very much still be a consequence. I think that is exactly what they are saying here. What has been, or do you expect to be, the most fun and engaging aspect of playing multiplayer as opposed to single player? Diplomatic plays with human opponents will be fun. Listen, I am so eager to really do this diplomatic play game, because it sort of already exists, both in Victoria 2, but also in other games, but Victoria 2, of course, to a larger degree, where you have a grudge, for example, against a different player. You want something that a different player in particular has. Maybe the player that wants to say, okay, I want to offer you something. I want you to have something so that you join, even if that something you're getting is mine, right? This sort of stuff now being formalized within its own mechanism really, really gets it right. That is what I want to see. Somebody commented that under the last video, they commented that Bokowan and whatnot, you know, when they are going to be playing the game in multiplayer, it will be a complete disaster. And I love it. I am ready for this. I am absolutely ready for them to basically shouting at themselves. I mean, I will be doing it with my own friends, you know how it is. So yeah, no, this is definitely easily the best part of this mechanic. What is the most interesting aspect, consequence of something you've already talked about that you were not able to place onto a dev diary? I don't actually recall if we've discussed urbanization in detail yet. I don't think they have. But one aspect I find fascinating is how building up your industrial states automatically create a parallel service industry which booms if the pop's wealth increases, but fails if it doesn't. So creating an exploitative, extractive industrial sector will decrease the price of the industrial output goods in the market, but not benefit any sector of pops in that state. There are goods, we know this, in urban centers. Services, I mean. There are services in urban centers. There's also transport. Of course, the richer you are, the more will you, take transport, for example, to do trips, whatever, that sort of stuff. Just like basic stuff. Obviously, yeah, I never considered that, but it's a really good point that Mikael Andersson raises here. The more you are exploiting your workers, the less will they be able to afford what, is going on right there in the service industry, and the more pops are basically going hungry. It's not just the pops in that industry, it's also the service adjacent pops. Obviously, if an industry goes down, industries that are genuinely attached, such as, for example, I produce metal and it turns out that, I don't know, the shipping industry, they need metal, and they go bankrupt. All of a sudden, I'm screwed. This is a very obvious connection, because it's a, you know, one step, two step. They are directly connected. But this one, the service industry, is very interesting, because it's a very indirect connection. I am eager to explore as many indirect connections as is possible, of course, primarily, you know, everything related to influencing the market in other countries and ruining their very existence. Very excited for that. Oh, and with that, we have actually reached the end of this dev diary. No, sorry, for this Q&A discussion. Let me know what you think. I will be doing the next video maybe in 2 or 3 days, something like that. Anyway, I am very, very eager to check out more, because there were many different topics. I think what is still coming up are general dev questions and then some miscellaneous stuff, but there's so much miscellaneous stuff that didn't fit in anywhere else and that was still good enough to be selected. So yeah, I'll see you then. Later, alligator.